Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and for this Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing something different. I thought it would be fun to make a video where I take some time to talk about both reading and writing for a change. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about 10 plot devices or tropes or techniques that drive me crazy in books. For each, I will try to give at least one example where this has come up in a book, and then give at least one example of how this type of trope can be done well in a book. I also want to clarify that I do enjoy most of the books I will talk about in this video, so by using them as negative examples, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, this book is terrible and bad and I hate it. In fact, the fact that I'm taking time to critique it and think about it really shows that I cared enough about it to spend time talking about it. Obviously, I'm giving my own personal opinion in this video, and I know many people will not feel the same way about these tropes or books, and that's perfectly fine. This also isn't a ranking of this trope is worse than this trope, but it's more of just my way of creating a list of some things that irritate me in books. Without further ado, let's get started. I'll go ahead and start with something that I've mentioned a few times on this channel, and that is that it drives me crazy when writers introduce interesting storylines, but then either abandon them or fail to do the ideas they introduce justice. One example is from Keeper of the Lost Cities, which has granted a lot of plot lines running throughout it that you have to keep track of. But one book made a really big deal about one of the important antagonists losing his memory, to the point where I thought that would be a focus of the next book. Instead, she kind of just brushed that plot point aside and then quickly resolved it by the end of the book, and so I really felt let down. I had a similar experience when reading Outcast of Redwall. Outcast stands out from the rest of the series because it's the only one with a premise that promises to explore the themes of nature versus nurture and whether or not someone is born evil or if they choose to do and be evil. Instead of grappling with this theme, the book mostly just pushes it off to the side until the climax, where it suddenly picks it up again and gives it a rapid conclusion that doesn't even necessarily make sense with where the story has gone up to that point. The problem with these books is not that they introduce too many plot lines, but that they promise the reader storylines that are then not fulfilled. Over the course of all 4 books, the Wingfeather saga introduces many characters, plots, and side plots, but one of the most rewarding parts of this series is that those are not forgotten. Peterson remembers the minor characters and continues their stories, and he also remembers the story elements that he has set up and will pay them off in a satisfying way before the series closes. Having many different storylines that you set up can actually be a great way to make a book more exciting and have multiple hooks for the reader. But it can be really frustrating when those storylines are abandoned or not given full time to develop. I really like to immerse myself in the world of whatever book I'm reading. Learning about its rules, history, and cultures is part of the fun of fiction. So, when a book introduces an element that seems disjointed with the rest of its world building, it really takes me out of the story and often confuses the plot. One such example is the mysterious Benedict Society. For the most part, the series is fairly grounded. Sure, it has its fair share of absurdity, but nothing feels particularly magical, only exceptional or highly improbable. The one element that breaks this is Constance Contraire. For the majority of the first book, the kids and the reader themselves think that Constance is just an abnormally short and cranky kid. At the end of the book, it is revealed that Constance is actually a highly intelligent and sensitive 2-year-old. That moment had me shouting, "What?" and ranting about the twist for a while, and not in a good way. The problem is not that the twist is odd, but that its oddity does not seem to fit within the overall world building that the book establishes. Another example is Silverwing. I will admit that I only read the first book in this series and could not bring myself to continue, largely because of world building issues. For large portions of the book, the bats seem normal and their world seems normal. Then you'll have weird moments where strange powers, bat cults, and hints of magic pop up. Throw in an antagonist who at times seems like a normal vampire bat and at other times seems a monster, and I was too confused by this book and what genre it was trying to be to continue the series. That's not to say a book can't incorporate a few magical elements without completely ruining its world building. In McAllister's Mistmantle Chronicles, a few magical elements are introduced at the beginning of the first book, such as the magical mists around the island and the shooting stars that predict important events. And because those are introduced early on, the reader expects a story that will have an occasional dash of magic. I love quirky and unique world building, but not when consistency is sacrificed for it. Having elements that are fun and unique, but that add to a cohesive world is what can really mark great fiction. What I've noticed, especially in the fantasy genre, is having protagonists suffer serious injury as a means of increasing tension in the story. While this can work, some books tend to overuse this strategy to the point where it actually lowers the tension by the constant injuries. A recent example is the Fireborn epic, a series which I actually quite enjoy, but still found this element to be frustrating. Most of the protagonists suffer severe injuries at some point, most of them suffer more than one, and while Adams doesn't allow them to just heal instantly, she does take time to show them recovering. The constant slashes through muscles, stabs through the hand, and breaking of bones really begins to wear out. This is another area where Keeper of the Lost Cities also struggles. Sophie and her friends end up in the hospital so frequently that it actually becomes a recurring joke in the series. At first, that joke was funny, but after about 7 books of the same thing, the trope becomes tiring. Injuries and wounds for characters can actually increase the tension if they are used well, but there needs to be actual consequences, and the writer needs to avoid overusing those injuries. The Lord of the Rings is an example of a book that does this very well. Despite all of the harrowing trials that they face, most of the main characters come out of the series with little more than a few scars. The one exception to this is Frodo, who suffers one significant injury per book. Since Frodo's wounds have a direct impact on the end of his story, Tolkien's use of the trope actually accomplishes the goal it was meant to achieve. The Hunger Games is another example of a series that uses injuries to good effect. One example is Peeta's leg, an injury that results in his limb being amputated and then continues to play a role in the following book. Other injuries sustained by Katniss and the other characters leave physical and or emotional scars that really add to the depth of the book. The injured protagonist trope really is one that can be very effective and gripping when done well, but can just lead to rolling my eyes when it's overused. This next plot device is another one that can be very effective when used well, but can be extremely frustrating when poorly executed. Memory loss, especially for a protagonist, is a trope that automatically garners interest. It can reveal more about the protagonist than if they had all their memories, and it can create some interesting drama when the new self clashes with their forgotten self. But it can also lead to a lot of annoyance for the reader. The second book of the Heroes of Olympus series features Percy Jackson, the character we all know and love. However, this time around, Percy does not remember who he is. Those who have already read Percy's previous adventures, it's really a slog to get through a book where he doesn't remember who he is or those adventures for most of the story. I found myself wanting to shout, "I know this already!" And yet Percy continued the book in ignorance. The book failed to show me anything new about Percy, and it felt like the memory loss plotline was entirely contrived just to get Percy in a new situation and out of his element. The book even goes so far as to basically acknowledge that fact. As I mentioned earlier, memory plots can be done well. Marielle of Redwall is one such book that uses the protagonist's forgetfulness to improve the story. When Marielle wakes with no memory of who she is, the reader is just as lost as she is. Learning who Marielle is alongside her makes for a much more compelling character. For me, the main draw of a memory loss plotline is to rediscover the character's past with that character. I don't want to rediscover someone who I've already come to know and love, but I'm happy to go on a journey of discovery with a stranger. Next trope is one that tends to really irritate me. While there are many types of villains, the know-it-all villain is probably my least favorite of the bunch. Having a villain who is constantly plotting out the protagonist's every move and flaunting their intelligence is really grating. This sort of villain can sometimes sour a whole book for me. The most blatant example I can think of is the character of Second Chance from Margaret Peterson Haddox's The Missing series. Second is a villain who's constantly taunting the protagonist with his knowledge, smugly rubbing in every success. Rather than making him threatening, I found myself just wanting to pull my hair out with frustration every time he appeared. A smart and scheming antagonist is not inherently a bad thing. Some series, like the Weaver trilogy, have pulled off the intelligent and manipulative villain very well. But the difference between this series and that of The Missing is that the villain in the Weaver trilogy actually feels intimidating. Second has no menace behind him, only smug bragging. For this sort of villain to be successful, the reader really needs to feel like they're an actual threat and not just an annoying nuisance. Another type of antagonist that I find really problematic is the child or teen antagonist. Having such a young villain can be viable in specific circumstances, but often it leads to the protagonist feeling inept or the conflict feeling forced. One example of a young antagonist is the character of Pup in the Mouseheart series. Pup is the younger brother of the main character Hopper, and he's also the runt of the litter. And yet, he still manages to garner a reputation as a threatening and despicable villain. Going from Felina, the Queen of the Cats, to Pup feels like a regression and keeps me from taking Pup or even the plot too seriously. The young antagonist trope can be quite effective when used properly. One example is Luke in the Percy Jackson series. Though Luke is only a teenager at the beginning of the series, he works very well as an antagonist to Percy, as he's nearer to Percy's level than, say, Kronos. When crafting a villain, the protagonist must be considered. Mouseheart fails to utilize Pup as an effective villain because, other than his familial tie to Hopper, he provides no challenge or interesting threat to the heroes. Luke, on the other hand, works better because he is a direct challenge and in some ways a parallel to Percy. Villains can be young, but there needs to be a reason for casting such a young villain within a book. I generally don't like when series abruptly change direction several books in. That may seem like an obvious critique, but I've read a surprising amount of series which do this, and I've even read some that have used that strategy well. Returning to The Missing, it was a book series that had its fair share of twists and turns, but I could always track with where the plot was going. That all changed with the final book. In the last book, things are turned upside down, and the reader is suddenly presented with a new main character, as well as a new threat, and even forced to return to previous plot points. Rather than making the conclusion interesting, it made me frustrated, and it seemed like Haddix wasn't sure how to end the series well, and so she made radical changes to force an ending. Another series which was ruined for me by the drastic shift was Ted Decker's The Lost Books. The first few books, with the 6-book series, while odd, follow a coherent plot. But halfway through the series, things get convoluted, and unexplained time travel and maybe world hopping occur, and the main characters suddenly become delusional, until book 5 decides to take on a completely different main character. I didn't realize there was a 6th book to this series until this week, when I was looking into it for this video, and the series was too scattered for me to feel the need to go back and read the final chapter of the story. All of this makes it sound like I don't have a tolerance for series changing directions, but that's actually not the case. The Land of Stories is a book series that began with a focus solely on fairy tales. However, once it got to books 4 and 5, it started incorporating other classic stories, or even stories written by one of the characters within the book. The characters also began interacting with the real world a lot more, and while Ted Decker brought his characters to the real world with confusing results, Chris Colfer manages to meld his fairy tale world and the real world and make it feel like it's expanding the series rather than confounding it. Writers can make bold changes in their stories and characters, but if it confuses the themes or the overarching narrative, it only makes me lose interest in the story rather than building investment. This next trope is one that leaves me rolling my eyes every time I encounter it, and that's the tendency for books to make every character end up in a romantic relationship. Not only does this feel contrived, but it also tends to distract from the more interesting elements occurring within the book. One series that made blatant use of this strategy was The Unwanteds. While I do enjoy this series, I was annoyed with how all the characters, except maybe the non-human ones, were forced into romantic relationships, kids and adults alike. Even characters who had no chemistry together ended up in relationships, seemingly for no purpose other than to be in a relationship. This distracted from the genuinely interesting world building and plot, and often added angst that didn't contribute to character development at all. Even though I'm not a romance fan, I don't mind romance when it is done well, and I can even enjoy it. The Miss Mantle Chronicles has many of its characters end up in romantic relationships by the end of the series. However, these all felt justified. The characters had their relationships built up and had clearly complementary personalities, even if they were very different from each other. Maybe the most important thing about this series is that not every character was forced into a relationship. Urchin was happy with Sepia, but Juniper was just as happy by himself, and the series was better for that. Romance can be an excellent addition to a narrative and can be a means of developing a character further, but forcing a relationship for the sake of a relationship only makes the story suffer. This next plot device is very specific as it only applies to time travel stories. I can't stand when time travel books decide to take the route of everything being changed and or ruined late into the series. Though I've not read many time travel books, there are a couple prominent examples which employ this strategy. The first is the Infinity Ring series. The very premise of the series is that the three main characters have to travel back into time and change historical events to change the present. Right off the bat, the reader is told that the characters are going to be significantly changing things. However, it's very unsatisfying and feels unfair after all they've gone through to have at the end one of the characters essentially erase themselves from history via their actions. The Missing takes a very different direction with this trope. The kids are trying to change time so that they can save people while still making it seem like the historical event has not changed. However, by the last book, a whole new reality is created, and the two realities combine, and the characters are basically just told they have to live with this new reality. I enjoyed a lot of the time shenanigans throughout the two series. However, I was frustrated to see them change everything within the last book or so. It felt like a cop-out as a way of wrapping up the series while still maintaining a sense of high stakes. While both series use time travel well at points and can have a lot of fun with it, I still felt their conclusions handled the time travel aspect poorly. I love a good, long book. Some of my favorites, The Lord of the Rings, Redwall, Watership Down, are quite lengthy. However, once a book fails to justify its length, it becomes a slog and I struggle to get through it. There are two ways in which I see this trend pop up. One, the book series has too many books than the story can justify, and two, the individual books are unnecessarily lengthy. Keeper of the Lost Cities is a series that struggles with both of these problems. While the books have always been long, the early entries really justified that length. The world had to be introduced, so of course you were going to have a longer book. But as the series has gone on, the books have maintained their length, but they have actually decreased in content. Did we need a full novel set almost entirely in a hospital room? Not only that, but the number of books in the series now exceeds 10, and the plot is still not wrapping up. Because of its length, I've actually quit reading the series until an end has actually arrived. Another series which I quit reading due to length is The Epic Order of the Seven, originally The Amazing Tales of Max and Liz. This series started out with longer books, the first being just over 400 pages. By book 3, the novel is a whopping 600 pages. Here's a comparison with how thick this book gets. Cote made the decision to cover the entire life of Jesus in a single book, a task that was understandably daunting, but is very daunting to the reader as well. It took me a very long time to read this book, and by the time I reached the end, I had no desire to continue the series. My sister has told me that Cote has since started splitting up the bigger story arcs into different books, but I've just lost the motivation to continue this series. Not all series are hurt by having longer books. The Wingfeather saga ends with a book much longer than all the previous ones. However, with all the storylines that it has to wrap up, it feels completely justified and actually has a faster pace than maybe all the books before it. Redwall is another long series, running for 22 books. However, this works because most of the books are largely disconnected from each other, so the reader has no obligation to keep up with all the details of every book. Lengthy series can be very enjoyable, but the writer needs to keep in mind the potential fatigue that the readers will experience. Can you expect your reader to continue through your series if you have enormous books with very little plot progression? Is there a reason for your series to have 10 books rather than 5? Having a genuine answer to these questions can help separate a series from being tedious and being riveting. Those are just some of the plot devices that tend to drive me nuts in books. If you have some of your own plot devices that frustrate you when you read them, I'd love to hear about that in the comments. I really liked making this video, so let me know if you'd like to see more like this. It was a lot of fun, and I like getting to talk about both reading and writing and some of my own general opinions on books. Thanks for watching. Bye!